Well, I told myself I was going to wait till tomorrow, but I simply can't put it down. We're going to read Northanger Abbey, chapter 15 of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, the brilliant and beautiful and incredible Jane Austen. Catherine's disposition was not naturally sedentary, nor had her habits been ever very industrious. But whatever might hitherto have been her defects of that sort, her mother could not but perceive them now to be greatly increased. She could neither sit still nor employ herself for 10 minutes together, walking round the garden and orchard again and again, as if nothing but motion was voluntary, and it seemed as if she would even walk about the house rather than remain fixed for any time in the parlour. Her loss of spirits was a yet greater alteration. In her rambling and her idleness, she might only be a caricature of herself, but in her silence and sadness, she was the very reverse of all that she had been before. That is really sad. That's really, really sad. For 2 days, Mrs. Morland allowed it to pass, even without a hint, but when a third night's rest had neither restored her cheerfulness, improved her in useful activity, nor given her a greater inclination for needlework, she could no longer refrain from the gentle reproof of, "My dear Catherine, I am afraid you are growing quite a fine lady. I do not know when poor Richard's cravats would be done, if he had no friend but you. Your head runs too much upon Bath. But there is time for everything, a time for balls and plays, and a time for work. You have had a long run of amusement, and now you must try to be useful." Catherine took up her work directly, saying in a dejected voice that her head did not run upon Bath much. "Then you are fretting about General Tilney, and that is very simple of you. For 10 to 1 whether you ever see him again. You should never fret about trifles." After a short silence, "I hope, my Catherine, you are not getting out of humour with home, because it is not so grand as Northanger. That would be turning your visit into an evil indeed. Wherever you are, you should always be contented, but especially at home, because there you must spend the most of your time. I did not quite like at breakfast to hear you talk so much of the French bread at Northanger. I am sure I do not care about the bread. It is all the same to me what I eat. There is a very clever essay in one of the books upstairs upon much such a subject, about young girls that have been spoilt for home by great acquaintance. The Mirror, I think. I will look it out for you some day or other, because I'm sure it will do you good." What does it say about the mirror? Black mirror. Such a good song and such a good show. What? What did we just read? Why is it in the back? The Mirror. Consequence to little folks of intimacy with great ones, in a letter from John Homespun. The Mirror. Mr. Homespun, daughters affect high fashion and susceptible attitudes on returning from Elizabeth, Lady blah blah blah. You would believe my daughter Elizabeth. This was Sophia. It's a book. Catherine said no more, and with an endeavour to do right, applied to her work, but after a few minutes sunk again, without knowing it herself, into languor and listlessness, moving herself in her chair from the irritation of weariness, much oftener than she moved her needle. Mrs. Morland watched the progress of this relapse, and seeing in her daughter's absent and dissatisfied look the full proof of what that repining spirit, to which she had now begun to attribute her want of cheerfulness, hastily left the room to fetch the book in question, anxious to lose no time in attacking so dreadful a malady. It was some time before she could find what she looked for, and other family matters occurring to detain her, 1/4 of an hour had elapsed ere she returned downstairs with the volume from which so much was hoped. Her avocations above having shut out all noise but what she created herself, she knew not that a visitor had arrived within the last minutes. Oh my God, please let it be Henry. Oh my God, please let it be Henry. A visitor had arrived within the last few minutes, till on entering the room, the first object she beheld was a young man whom she had never seen before. With a look of much respect, he immediately rose, and being introduced to her by her conscious daughter as well as Mr. Henry Tilney, yes, with the embarrassment of real sensibility, began to apologize for his appearance there, acknowledged that after what had passed he had little right to expect a welcome at Fullerton, and stating his impatience to be assured of Miss Morland's having reached her home in safety as the cause of his intrusion. He did not address himself in an uncandid judge or a resentful heart. Far from comprehending him or his sister in their father's misconduct, Mrs. Morland had been always kindly disposed towards each, and instantly, pleased by his appearance, received him with the simple professions of unaffected benevolence, thanking him for such an attention to her daughter, assuring him that the friends of her children were always welcome there, and entreating him to say not another word of the past. He was not ill-inclined to obey this request, for though his heart was greatly relieved by such unlooked-for mildness, it was not just at that moment in his power to say anything to the purpose. Returning in silence to his seat, therefore, he remained for some minutes, most civilly answering all Mrs. Morland's common remarks about the weather and roads. Catherine, meanwhile, the anxious, agitated, happy, feverish Catherine, said not a word, but her glowing cheek and brightened eye made her mother trust that this good-natured visit would at least set her heart at ease for a time, and gladly, therefore, did she lay aside the first volume of the Mirror for a future hour. Desirous of Mr. Morland's assistance, as in giving encouragement as in finding conversation for her guest, whose embarrassment on his father's account she earnestly pitied, Mrs. Morland had very early dispatched one of the children to summon him. But Mr. Morland was from home, and being thus without any support, at the end of a quarter of an hour, she had nothing to say. After a couple of minutes' unbroken silence, Henry, turning to Catherine for the first time since her mother's entrance, asked her, with sudden alacrity, if Mr. and Mrs. Allen were now at Fullerton, and on developing from amidst all her perplexity of words in reply, the meaning which one short syllable would have given, immediately expressed his intention of paying his respects to them, and with a rising colour asked her if she would have the goodness to show him the way. "You may see the house from this window, sir," was information on Sarah's side, which produced only a bow of acknowledgment from the gentleman, and a silencing nod from her mother, for Mrs. Morland, thinking it probable, as a secondary consideration in his wish of waiting on their worthy neighbours, that he might have some explanation to give of his father's behaviour, which it must be more pleasant for him to communicate only to Catherine, would not on any account prevent her accompanying him. They began their walk, and Mrs. Morland was not entirely mistaken in his object in wishing it. Some explanation on his father's account he had to give, but his first purpose was to explain himself, and before they reached Mr. Allen's ground he had done it so well that Catherine did not think it could ever be repeated too often. She was assured of his affection, and that his heart in return was solicited, which perhaps they pretty equally knew was already entirely his own. For though Henry was now sincerely attached to her, though he felt and delighted in all the excellencies of her character and truly loved her society, I must confess that his affection originated in nothing better than gratitude, or, in other words, that a persuasion of her partiality for him had been the only cause of giving her a serious thought. It is a new circumstance in romance, I acknowledge, and dreadfully derogatory of a heroine's dignity, but if it be as new in common life, the credit of a wild imagination will at least be all my own. She's talking directly to us again. Very short visit to Mrs. Allen, in which Henry talked at random, without sense or connection, and Catherine, wrapped in the contemplation of her own unutterable happiness, scarcely opened her lips, dismissed them to the ecstasies of another tete-a-tete, and before it was suffered to close, she was unable to judge how far he was sanctioned by parental authority in his present application. On his return from Woodstone 2 days before, he had been met near the Abbey by his impatient father, hastily informed in angry terms of Miss Morland's departure, and ordered to think of her no more. Such was the permission upon which he now offered her his hand. The affrighted Catherine, amidst all the terrors of expectation as she listened to his account, could not but rejoice in the kind caution with which Henry had saved her from the necessity of conscientious rejection by engaging her faith before he mentioned the subject, and as he proceeded to give the particulars and explain the motives of his father's conduct, her feelings soon hardened into a triumphant delight. The general had had nothing to accuse her of, nothing to lay to her charge, but her being the involuntary, unconscious object of a deception which his pride could not pardon, and which a better pride would have been ashamed to own. She was guilty only of being less rich than he had supposed her to be. Under a mistaken persuasion of her possessions and claims, he had courted her acquaintance in Bath, solicited her company at Northanger, and designed her for his daughter-in-law. On discovering his error, to return her from the house seemed the best, though to his feelings an inadequate proof of his resentment towards herself and his contempt for her family. John Thorpe had first misled him. The general, perceiving his son one night at the theatre to be paying considerable attention to Miss Morland, had accidentally inquired of Thorpe if he knew more of her than her name. Thorpe, most happy to be on speaking terms with a man of General Tilney's importance, had been joyful and proudly communicative, and being at that time not only in daily expectation of Morland's engaging Isabella, but likewise pretty well resolved upon marrying Catherine himself, his vanity induced him to represent the family as yet more wealthy than his vanity and avarice had made him believe them. Wow. With whomsoever he was, or was likely to be connected, his own consequence always required that theirs should be great, and as his intimacy with any acquaintance grew, so regularly grew their fortune. The expectations of his friend Morland, therefore, from the first overrated, had ever since his introduction to Isabella been gradually increasing, and by merely adding twice as much for the grandeur of the moment, by doubling what he chose to think the amount of Mr. Morland's preferment, trebling his private fortune, bestowing a rich aunt, and sinking half the children, he was able to represent the whole family to the general in a most respectable light. For Catherine, however, the peculiar object of the general's curiosity and his own speculations, he had yet something more in reserve, and the 10 or 15,000 pounds which her father could give her would be a pretty addition to Mr. Allen's estate. Her intimacy there had made him seriously determined on being handsomely legacied hereafter, and to speak of her, therefore, as the almost acknowledged future heiress of the Fullerton naturally followed. Wow. Upon such intelligence, the general had proceeded. Yeah, and the whole time he was like, sorry about our terrible food options. And she's like, this is like more food than I've ever seen. And he's like, I know this place must seem like pretty shabby to you. She's like, no, it's really nice. Thorpe's interest in the upon such intelligence, it never occurred to an authority. Thorpe's interest in the family, by his sister's approaching connection with one of its members, and its own views on another, circumstance of which he boasted with almost equal openness, seemed sufficient vouchers for his truth. And to these were added the absolute facts of the Allens being wealthy and childless, of Miss Morland's being under their care, and as soon as his acquaintance allowed him to judge, of their treating her with parental kindness. His resolution was soon formed. Already he had discerned a liking towards Miss Morland in the countenance of his son, and thankfully of Mr. Thorpe's communication, he almost instantly determined to spare no pains in weakening his boasted interest and ruining his dearest hopes. Catherine herself could not be more ignorant at the time of all this than his own children. Henry and Eleanor, perceiving nothing in her situation likely to engage their father's particular respect, had seen with astonishment the suddenness, continence, and extent of his attention, and though laterally, from some hints which had accompanied an almost positive command to his son of doing everything in his power to attach her, Henry was convinced of his father's believing it to be an advantageous connection. It was not till the late explanation at Northanger that they had the smallest idea of the false calculations which had hurried him on. That they were false, the general had learnt from the very person who had suggested them, from Thorpe himself, whom he had chanced to meet again in town, and who, under the influence of exactly opposite feelings, irritated by Catherine's refusal, and yet more by the failure of a very recent endeavour to accomplish and reconcile between Morland and Isabella, convinced that they were separated forever, and spurning a friendship which could be no longer serviceable, hastened to contradict all that he had said before in advantage of the Morlands. Confessed himself to have been totally mistaken in his opinion of their circumstance and character, misled by the rhodomontade of his friend to believe his father a man of substance and credit, whereas the transactions of the 2 or 3 last weeks proved him to be neither. For after coming eagerly forward on the first overture of a marriage between the families, with the most liberal proposals, he had, on being brought to the point by the shrewdness of the realtor, been constrained to acknowledge himself incapable of giving the young people even a decent support. They were, in fact, a necessitous family, numerous too, almost beyond example, by no means respected in their own neighbourhood, as he had lately and particularly opportunities of discovering, aiming at a style of life which their fortune could not warrant, seeking to better themselves by wealthy connections, a forward, bragging, scheming race. The terrified general pronounced the name of Allen with an inquiring look, and here too Thorpe had learnt his error. The Allens, he believed, had lived near them too long, and he knew the young man on whom the Fullerton estate must devolve. The general needed no more. Enraged with almost everybody in the world but himself, he set out the next day for the Abbey, where his performances have been seen. I leave it to my reader's sagacity to determine how much of all this it was possible for Henry to communicate at this time to Catherine, how much of it he could have learnt from his father, in what points his own conjectures might assist him, and what portion must yet remain to be told in a letter from James. I have united for their ease what they must divide for mine. Catherine, at any rate, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of neither murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character, or magnified his cruelty. Henry, in having such things to relate for his father, was almost as pitiable as in their first avowal to himself. He blushed for the narrow-minded counsel which he was obliged to expose. The conversation between them at Northanger had been of the most unfriendly kind. Henry's indignation on hearing how Catherine had been treated, on comprehending his father's views, and being ordered to acquiesce in them, had been open and bold. The general, accustomed on every ordinary occasion to give the law in his family, prepared for no reluctance but of feeling, no opposing desire that should dare to clothe itself in words, could ill brook the opposition of his son, steady as the sanction of reason and the dictate of conscience could make it. But in such a cause his anger, though it must shock, could not intimidate Henry, who was sustained in his purpose by a conviction of its justice. He felt himself bound as much in honour as affection to Miss Morland, and believing that heart to be his own, which he had been directed to gain, no unworthy retraction of tacit consent, no reversing decree of unjustifiable anger, could shake his fidelity, or influence the resolutions it prompted. He steadily refused to accompany his father to Herefordshire, an engagement formed almost at the moment to promote the dismissal of Catherine, and as steadily declared his intentions of offering her his hand. The general was furious in his anger, and they parted in dreadful disagreement. Henry, in an agitation of mind, which many solitary hours were required to compose, had returned almost instantly to Woodstone, and on the afternoon of the following day had begun his journey to Fullerton. Whoa. I'm going to finish this book right now. Chapter 16. Mr. and Mrs. Morland's surprise on being applied to by Mr. Tilney for their consent to his marrying their daughter was for a few minutes considerable, it having never entered their heads to suspect an attachment on either side, but as nothing, after all, could be more natural than Catherine's being beloved. They soon learnt to consider it with only the happy agitation of a gratified pride, and as far as they alone were concerned, had not a single objection to start. His pleasing manners and good sense were self-evident recommendations, and having never heard evil of him, it was not their way to suppose any evil could be told. Goodwill supplying the place of experience, his character needed no attestation. Catherine would make a sad, heedless young housekeeper, to be sure, was her mother's foreboding remark, but quick was the consolation of there being nothing like practice. There was but one obstacle, in short, to be mentioned, but till that one was removed, it must be impossible for them to sanction the engagement. Their tempers were mild, but their principles were steady, and while his parents so expressly forbade the connection, they could not allow themselves to encourage it. That the general should come forward to solicit the alliance, or that he should even very heartily approve it, they were not refined enough to make any parading stipulation, but the decent appearance of consent must be yielded, and that once obtained, and their own hearts made them trust that it could not be very long denied, their willing approbation was instantly to follow. His consent was all they wished for. They were no more inclined than entitled to demand his money. Of a very considerable fortune his son was, by marriage settlements, eventually secure. His present income was an income of independence and comfort, and under every pecuniary view it was a match beyond the claims of their daughter. The young people could not be surprised at a decision like this. They felt, and they deplored, but they could not resent it. And they parted, endeavouring to hope that such a change in the general, as each believed almost impossible, must speedily take place to unite them again in the fullness of privileged affection. Henry returned to what was now his only home, to watch over his young plantations, and extend his improvements for her sake, to whose share in them he looked anxiously forward, and Catherine remained at Fullerton to cry. Whether the torments of absence were softened by a clandestine correspondence, let us not inquire. Mr. and Mrs. Morland never did. They had been too kind to exact any promise, and whenever Catherine received a letter, as at that time happened pretty often, they always looked another way. The anxiety, which in this state of their attachment must be the portion of Henry and Catherine, and of all who loved either, as to its final event, can hardly extend, I fear, to the bosom of my readers, who will see in the telltale compression of the pages before them, that we are all hastened together to perfect felicity. The means by which their marriage was effected can be the only doubt. What probable circumstance could work upon the temper like the general's? The circumstance which chiefly availed was the marriage of his daughter with a man of fortune and consequence, which took place in the course of a summer. An ascension of dignity that threw him into a fit of good humour, from which he did not recover till after Eleanor had obtained his forgiveness of Henry, and his permission for him to be a fool if he liked it. The marriage of Eleanor Tilney, her removal from all the evils of such a home as Northanger, had been made by Henry's banishment to the home of her choice and the man of her choice, is an event which I expect to give general satisfaction among all her acquaintance. My own joy on the occasion is very sincere. I know no one more entitled by unpretending merit, or better prepared by habitual suffering, to receive and enjoy felicity. Her partiality for this gentleman was not of recent origin, and he had been long withheld only by inferiority of situation from addressing her. His unexpected ascension to title and fortune had removed all his difficulties, and never had the general loved his daughter so well in all her hours of companionship, utility, and patient endurance, as when he first hailed her, "Your ladyship." Her husband was really deserving of her, independent of his peerage, his wealth, and his attachment, being to a precision the most charming young man in the world. Any further definition of his merits must be unnecessary. The most charming man in the world is instantly before the imagination of us all. Concerning the one in question, therefore, I have only to add, aware that the rules of composition forbid the intrusion of a character not connected with my fable, that this was the very gentleman whose negligent servant left behind him that collection of washing bills, resulting from a long visit at Northanger Abbey, by which my heroine was involved in of her most alarming adventures. The influence of the Viscount and Viscountess in their brother's behalf was assisted by that right understanding of Mr. Morland's circumstances which, as soon as the general would allow himself to be informed, they were qualified to give. It taught him that he had been scarcely more misled by Thorpe's first boast of the family wealth than by his subsequent malicious overthrow of it, that in no sense of the word were they necessitous or poor, and that Catherine would have £3,000. This was so material an amendment of his late expectations that it greatly contributed to smooth the descent of his pride, and by no means without its effect, was the private intelligence which he was at some pains to procure, that the Fullerton estate, being entirely at the disposal of its present proprietor, was consequently open to every greedy speculation. On the strength of this, the General, soon after Eleanor's marriage, permitted his son to return to Northanger, and thence made him the bearer of his consent, very courteously worded in a page full of empty professions to Mr. Morland. The event which it authorized soon followed. Henry and Catherine were married. The bells rang, and everybody smiled. And as this took place within a 12-month from the first day of their meeting, it will not appear, after all the dreadful delays occasioned by the General's cruelty, that they were essentially hurt by it. To begin perfect happiness at the respective ages of 26 and 18 is to do pretty well, and professing myself moreover convinced that the General's unjust interference, so far from being really injurious to their felicity, was perhaps rather conducive to it, by improving their knowledge of each other and adding strength to their attachment, I leave it to be settled by whomsoever it may concern, whether the tendency of this work be altogether to recommend parental tyranny or reward filial disobedience. End of volume 2. I'm gonna cry. Look at this cute map. God, I have no idea where the camera is on this. The little map. Pulteney Street, Laura Place. Oh, it's Bath. Oh, cool. The upper chamber, the lower chamber. The Green Park. Ugh. And that's that for all of Jane Austen's books. I've read them all on the YouTubes. And now, off to my next adventure. We'll see what that is. I can't even believe it. Can I say which one is my favorite? I don't think I can. They were all so surprising to me, and I still feel surprised that I can even understand it and love it. Because it did at first feel like such a foreign language. I encourage us all to read the classics, and I'm here to do that. I think it would be so fun to continue on. I'm going to go have a little cry. And thank you, Jane Austen. This has been such a crazy world that's opened up to me that I had no idea. A whole new world. And I truly can believe that there are so many Jane Austen fans, and she's so revered over 250 years ago. So grateful for this time to spend doing this. And as usual, happy reading to you all, and ta-ta for now.